Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast, joining me from her home in Utah County, is my friend Marley Orton. Welcome to the podcast, Marley.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate this opportunity.
Let me tell you a little bit about Marley. I got an email from Marley 2 weeks ago and said, I'm the mother of an adult non-binary child who has transitioned to their level of comfort. I'm writing you to ask if I could be a guest on your podcast. Recently, I've had what I believe are promptings from the Lord to find better ways to share my story, to educate others on the complexities of gender, biological and otherwise. Being on a podcast is way out of my comfort zone, but I truly believe that education in the area is essential, especially now that we're overturning so many of the policies. I think that recurs to what government is doing and perhaps the new church policy. It's been a very difficult week, especially for my child. There needs to be more understanding and compassion for our trans and non-binary brothers and sisters. I've heard you talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan and how you've come to see our trans and non-binary brothers and sisters in this parable. The first time I heard you express this, I became so emotional. I think you're on the money. Just like the Samaritans in those days were some of the most despised people, the trans and non-binary community is some of the most despised of our day. So listeners, that's how often a podcast starts, is someone just gets an impression, and my email address is in the podcast description wherever you listen. And Marley just emailed me, and I'm so grateful that Marley's going to be on the podcast to share her story as an LDS parent of a non-binary child. And you can see from the email the love in her heart and wanting to help us all better support these good people. Marley is in her 50s. She has 3 kids. She served a mission to the Dominican Republic. Professionally, she is a hairstylist and a real estate broker. And I'm just really grateful to have you on the podcast. And we said a prayer. We just hope this is helpful for you. If you want to better support non-binary and trans people in your circle, it might be family, it might be the church. And if you're listening and a non-binary trans person, we hope the things that Marley says would be helpful to you, and know there's people that love you and are trying to do their very best to help you find hope in their lives. So with that introduction, is that okay, Marley?
That's wonderful. Thank you, Richard. First of all, speaking of inspiration, I just know that you were inspired to start this podcast because, as we were discussing a little bit before, it's people's stories that can invoke change, that can change people's hearts, not necessarily statistics or science, although those things do support people's stories. And it's people's stories that have really helped me in this process. I've been down the path a little over a decade, so that has been very supportive of my journey. So I appreciate all that you do. So just a little about me. I'm 5th of 7 kids, and we moved around quite a bit when I was a child. My dad's work transferred him about every other year, but we moved to Utah when I was in 2nd grade. So with the exception of my mission, and my parents moved back to Alabama for a time, and I went for a little while and lived with them. I've spent most of my life in Utah. I really did have a happy childhood. We were churchgoers and scripture readers and family home evening and all the things, right? And with 7 kids, there was, conflict, but there was also a lot of laughs and fun. So, and my parents absolutely did the best they could. And I'm grateful every day for my family of origin. I am, like you said, I'm a mother of 3. I'm a wife of 32 years. My husband is just a wonderful, amazing person. He's more down to earth and keeps me kind of grounded. He calms me down when I get upset, and he's just the I don't know the word for it, but we're yin and yang. How's that?
Love that.
So as I said, I've been a lifelong church member, and you mentioned that I served a mission in the Dominican Republic. I did one thing that's I think is kind of interesting is my dad was born and raised in Mississippi, so really deep South, and generations lived there, right? So they were raised in a very racist environment. My grandfather was a patriarch for many years. He gave me my patriarchal blessing. And he, when the revelation was given to extend the priesthood and temple blessings to Black members of the church, I had always heard that my grandpa almost left the church, and he and my grandma were converts, actually, as parents with 3 young children. And when I received my mission call to the Dominican Republic, I remember sitting down with him. I was in Alabama at the time because my dad wanted to help me with that, and we went over to visit my grandparents in Mississippi, and he sat me down and he said, a lot of people thought that the reason I wanted to leave the church was because they extended the priesthood and temple blessings to Black people, but that wasn't it. He said, I had a faith crisis because all that I had heard all the years that I've been a member was that would never happen. And he didn't say faith crisis, but that's what he experienced. And so I think it was really, I know it was inspired for me to be called to the Dominican Republic because those people are people of color. And honestly, it was amazing. And I love them. I've always been a person that has noticed like the kid that's being left out. And especially those people that don't look like me or are not like me. I'm very aware of them, and I really like to make them feel included. So this was the perfect place for me to go. And they are just Dominicans are the most amazing and loving people. And they taught me a lot about love. As a member of the church in my adult years, I've held all the leadership positions that a woman can hold in the ward and then in the Stake and Women's. I served in the temple in the office for 1.5 years, and I loved that. That was very special. Now, growing up, I had a few experiences with people in the LGBTQ community. You mentioned going to Gridley, California not too long ago, and I told you that's where my mom's cousins lived, and so I had gone there in my childhood a few times. And when I was 12 years old, I met this boy who was a distant cousin of mine. And while he didn't know, and we didn't know at the time, he later came out as gay, and we became pen pals for a little while. And he was just such a kind and loving person. And I heard later, and I can't remember how many years ago, that he had passed away from AIDS, and that really brought me a lot of sorrow. And then when I went to beauty school, we had just a fun, gregarious, loving, humorous kid that was in school there that was gay, but loved dressing up as Marilyn Monroe. And he was the best. So loved the drag, and he was just fun, and everybody, you couldn't resist loving him. I worked for many years as an oral surgery assistant, and we had a transgender woman come in as a patient as part of her transitioning. And I just remember, I think back on things that I think and say, and I shudder, but I know that it's where I was at the time. And I just thought, boy, it's a shame that they don't that she doesn't feel comfortable in her body, and that in the resurrection that all this work that she's done is just going to go back. And that's, that was my level of ignorance at the time. But I think a lot of people do think that or feel that. And then my husband has several cousins that are gay. So I've had a lot of experience. But because of my upbringings and teachings and things that you just hear, whether they're just people's opinions or doctrine or whatever, I had thoughts and perceptions and beliefs about the queer community. And then also I was a teen in the 80s. So that was the AIDS scare. And there was a lot of talk, just a lot of propaganda, against the gay queer community and fear around that. So that's kind of where my growing up was and my experience, my limited experience with the queer community. I got married at 25, and since we were a little older by Utah standards, we just felt like we needed to go ahead and start a family. And we experienced infertility, and that was very difficult because my whole life I just wanted to be a mother. And I remember many times kneeling by my bed and just sobbing and pleading to be able to be a mother, and thinking that maybe it was in God's wisdom and maybe I wouldn't be a good mother, and that's why I was not able to conceive. During this time, God blessed me with a series of dreams about my babies, and it brought so much hope and comfort. I had they were very vivid dreams, felt like real. And when I woke up, I wanted to go right back into them. But I had the first dream was about my oldest son, and I had these dreams, and then later, I'm doing something and I have that deja vu and realize, oh, this was my dream. So the first one was about my oldest son. And then I had at least 2 dreams about twins, a boy and a girl. And then the last dream was about a girl. So after all different avenues of treatment, I finally was able to conceive and had my first baby. And then, and that was my second pregnancy. And then my third pregnancy, I just immediately knew it was twins. So I went into my OB and they did an ultrasound, and they found the 2 sacs and the 2 little heartbeats and printed out. I have to this day black and white proof of my twins, and I just knew that they were the twins from my dreams. Fairly early on, probably 12 or 13 weeks. I remember because it was conference weekend, and I started having some pain in my abdomen and nothing else, just some pain. And I had a regularly scheduled doctor appointment the next week, and went in, and they put the ultrasound on, and they couldn't find one of the twins. And one of the twins had passed. And I later learned that there's something called vanishing twin syndrome, which is, twins, one has passed and one survives. I never went through any kind of miscarriage with that or anything. And this is important for later. So I had 3 children. Our oldest, his name is Luke. He's always been very precocious, intelligent, happy, all about making people laugh. When he was 10 years old, he was diagnosed with an incurable type of sarcoma. And so we went through many years of treatment and surgeries. And it was a very difficult time through, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And through that time, we experienced a loss of job, a loss of our home, like all of the things, right? My best friend during that time called me Job.
Wow.
Yeah, it would, and it affects the whole family, right? Like, in one way, I am so grateful for that experience because what it brought to me and who I became through it, and the connection that and bond that it brought between me and my son. And there's other things that the other children don't get. So my second child, who was born named Cecilia Hope, so took on a caregiver role to their younger brother. And, that was fairly early in their life. So let's talk about Cecilia, who is now Cece. Cece has always been a very sensitive, very sweet person, really affected. Like you could not look at them cross-eyed without them just falling to pieces. I could never say I was disappointed because they were just so sensitive. Always super inclusive, and similar to me, like included people who were left out and loved animals. So when I was pregnant with my third, whose name is Zach, we would read from the scripture readers to our kids. And there was a time for a few months when I read to Cece that they would want me, no matter what story I read, I would have to go back and read about Zacharias and Elizabeth over and over every night. And I didn't know why, but, it was at least a couple months. So that kind of dwindled out. And then I had my third, which is Zach and Zachary. And honestly, we didn't name Zachary because of Elizabeth and Zacharias. We were going through a baby book and we said that, it was the very end, we said that name and it just hit us like that's his name. And we didn't know that it was a boy, but we knew because of the name. And it wasn't until a few months later that I remembered about Cece wanting me to read about Elizabeth and Zacharias. And I just had this impression, sorry, I'm going to get emotional, but I had this impression that was her twin.
Wow.
And that they missed that twin. And you could tell by the bond that they had, like Cece could be laying watching TV and would let Zach just crawl all over him and was not bothered at all. And Zach just adored Cece growing up. Zach, just a little bit about him. He's always been shy, introverted, but has the greatest imagination. And like I said, he just always loved being with Cece. So we can fast forward to when Cece came out, unless you have any questions so far. Okay.
This is just great. Keep sharing, Marley.
Okay. So we fast forward. First of all, probably about the time when Cece was in first grade, they really started saying that they didn't want to wear girly clothes. They just, they didn't want that. They just wanted to dress more neutral. And by the time they were in fourth grade, they were insisting that they wear all boys' clothes, which was fine with me because they could wear hand-me-downs from their older brother, right? And I found out later that whenever we'd be at a wishing fountain and they'd ask for a coin, they would wish to be a boy. So fast forward to when Cece is about 14 in Young Women's and going to that, activities and things like that. I started having impressions about it came on gradually, but just small impressions preparing me that Cece was going to come out, that Cece, was special. And Cece was teased and taunted by other kids in church. I remember having to go pick them up from a youth conference because they had been teased so much and rumors flying about them, and they were so upset. But they also had a few really good friends and a couple of really amazing young women leaders who made sure that they felt seen and heard and loved and had so much compassion. I'm so grateful for them. So at the age of 16, they came out as pansexual, which if anyone in the audience doesn't know what that means, it's basically they are attracted to a person regardless of gender. So they're more attracted to the person than really anything about gender or anything else. And that's how they came out. And it was a pretty traumatic event for Cece because they were out of town and had something happened and had attempted to take their life. And so called. And so in that moment, I was so grateful to my heavenly parents for preparing me so that I could be that loving, accepting, supportive parent that I needed to be in that case. And I think it brought a lot of peace to CC, knowing, because I know they were scared to come out because of all the things you think, the little things we had said over the years about being gay because we didn't know any better. My heavenly parents, whenever I prayed, which was often, always emphasized just loving, just accepting and supporting Cece. And I felt the intense need of having that closeness to my heavenly parents because I felt like it wasn't a tightrope. I felt like I was walking on tight dental floss, that any misstep, could mean the life of my child. And so I had to rely heavily on my heavenly parents and personal revelation and guidance through this whole time. I had many sleepless nights, just staying awake and making sure they stayed in the world. They experienced body dysphoria. They didn't talk a lot about it to me. They felt ostracized, especially at church. And one state conference, I remember the state president, this was, I think, in 2013, and this is all around the time of Prop 8 and, the marriage question. And the state president spoke all about marriage being between a man and a woman. And when we got home, which, is our doctrine, when we got home, Cece was sobbing and just said, "God hates me." And I said, "No, God does not hate you. I know that God loves you." And they said, "Then why does his chosen leader say things against me?" And I just said, they just don't know. It's just like Jesus said on the cross, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." They don't have understanding. They haven't traveled this path. So it was getting increasingly hard for Cece to be engaged in the church and participate. And I always encouraged, and we worked so hard to find ways that they could stay engaged. I remember for a few years, they didn't want to wear a dress. They didn't want to wear a skirt. And I insisted, and they had my mom make a denim skirt because I couldn't find one to buy, and they wore that. And finally, it was just, I'm just going to be glad if they're there. And so they started wearing pants. And, now I regret that because they did not feel comfortable in a dress or a skirt, but I was just grateful to have them there however I could. And we moved into a different ward in Stake and had this great bishop, and we had convinced Cece. So Cece was 17 at the time, so still supposed to be in Young Women's. And we had convinced Cece. We got the calling as nursery leaders, which I loved. Convinced Cece to come and at least for the second hour or second and third hour, because that was before the change, and be with the kids with us. And so they did. And honestly, those kids adored Cece, and Cece adored them. They would bring their guitar and play. And the bishop actually called them to that calling, which is, unusual, because as 17 years old, you're supposed to go to Young Women's and the youth Sunday school class. So I was so grateful to that bishop at that time, doing whatever he could to keep Cece engaged. So about a year later, we all know what happened in November of 2015. And I remember the exact place I was. It was in my family room. It was in the evening. And I can't remember exactly how, whether it was a news report or social media or what, that I saw the policy, the exclusion policy that the church put out. And I dropped to my knees and just sobbed, because I just knew in that moment that all the work and effort we had done was just ruined. We had tried so hard, and I just knew this was going to distance Cece even more. And I prayed, and I received comfort and peace. And just the only answer was, I love my children. I love my children. So one by one, our kids stepped away. Our kids are very close, and I'm so grateful that they love each other so much. And it wasn't just that policy. That was kind of, I won't say the straw that broke the camel's back. I think it a lot heavier than a straw. That was like the anvil that broke the camel's back. But there had been other things that had come up that many people, since the internet has come up, different things in church history and things that had troubled them. And so that was just, too much and too heavy. And they all stepped away from the church, and I understood. And I received confirmation with all of them that this was part of their eternal path, that this was necessary for their eternal progress and for the things that they would experience in life and who they would become. So a few years after that, I had been talking with a close friend of mine about Cece, and how Cece would only wear guys' clothes, and how they didn't really feel comfortable in their body, but they didn't identify as transgender. And she sent me this article about this family. And before I start talking about this, I just want to give a disclaimer. This is our story. This is how we've experienced, and it is not a blanket theory for everyone. I know that it's very complex. Transgender and non-binary and intersex people is very complex. And so I don't want to think that anyone to think that I'm being dismissive of anyone else's story, because we all have our unique stories. And this is just my experience, my thoughts, and my theories. So I read that article, and it was about a family in Washington State, and they were trying to get on some government program, and they needed to have some DNA testing. And the results of that, I think she had 4 or 5 kids, or there were 4 or 5 kids in the story. And it came back that none of her kids had her DNA.
Wow.
And she was shocked, and they were going to take her children away. So she had to have, doctors, nurses come and testify that, they had delivered these children out of her body. They were, in fact, her children. She had further testing, and they found that unbeknownst to her and her mother, she was a twin. So before her mother had any idea about having twins, the one twin had passed, that vanishing twin syndrome. And then it talked about this condition called chimera twin syndrome. And what that is, and just to preface, Dr. Christine Kuhn, whom has been on your podcast a couple of times, and the episode 782, she went into such great detail about different ways in scientific biology, genetics, epigenetics, that kind of thing. She briefly touched on chimerism. But this chimera twin syndrome, what happens is that twin that was developing had cells, had DNA, and the surviving twin absorbs those cells and that DNA. So her children were actually her twin sisters, had her twin sisters' DNA.
Wow.
So essentially they were her twin sisters' kids, right?
Wow.
If you're black and white like that. And that was really helpful because of the dreams I had, the ultrasound I had confirming that I had twins. And then there were other little things, like, for example, when Cece had their wisdom teeth removed, instead of having 4, they had 6. So there was some physical evidences. I'm sure you know who Joseph Grenny is.
Yeah.
He wrote the book Crucial Conversations, right? He has said something that really has helped me in a lot of areas of my life, but is especially pertinent in this. He said, God sets things in motion far in advance to help us when we need it. And I just considered those dreams, the ultrasound, all those little things that were set in motion. And then this story to find out that there is this syndrome, that not that it matters, not that somebody has to have something like that to validate how they feel and how they identify. It just helped me realize and open me up to the complexity of our bodies and our brains and everything that goes along with that. So at the age of 23, and I'm sure there's many people that have explained that this is a journey, it's not that people immediately come out as non-binary or transgender or any of that, but Cece had an amazing therapist, and they finally were able to find an identity that resonated with them, and that was non-binary. And with this chimera twin syndrome, we don't have any lab reports or anything like that. There are tests that can be done. We haven't done that yet, but just the experiences I've had, whether this is true or not, I think, if they in fact absorbed the DNA and cells from their twin, and that twin was male, then it's completely possible that they have both male and female DNA. So non-binary just makes sense. And people that are non-binary, it's not the same for everyone. Some people do not identify with either gender. Some identify with both genders, and CC identifies ambiguous. So after that discovery, they started looking into what they could do to transition. And this was a lot of thoughtful decisions, research. They did not take this lightly, but they felt more comfortable male presenting. And so they started on hormone replacement therapy. And honestly, within a couple of months, I can't tell you the difference I saw in them. They were happier. They were more confident. It was really, honestly, like night and day. And it just, as a mom, just warmed my heart, just made me happy. And then they chose, it was a year ago this month that they had top surgery. And on the way to the hospital for that top surgery, they shared with me that just that week in therapy, they had remembered going through puberty and being so disturbed and alarmed about the formation of their breasts, and that they would do anything to just be able to cut them off or keep them from growing, or that it was just so hard, and that added to their suicidal ideation. So they had a successful top surgery. The surgeon was amazing. And that just brought just a whole nother level of confidence and feeling like finally they truly feel themselves. Since then, in this past year, they've done the legal work to get their name and gender marker changed, a new birth certificate, driver's license. And they had originally decided they were going to put other on their gender marker, but then after the election thought it would be safer that they mark the male gender marker. And so that's what they did. So they went before the judge in October. They were really nervous because, it seems like a crapshoot of what people's opinions and thoughts are on it. And we were there with two other people that were, had done the legal work. One of them had their mother and a friend with them, and the other one had no one at all, which just broke my heart that they didn't have someone there supporting them. But we kind of came together and, just hugged them and gave support to them. But this judge, I could not have prayed or chosen for a more amazing judge than this one. He listened to each of their stories. He asked them questions. And then he said, "This is the best part of my job." He said, "I just love being able to help transgender and non-binary people on their journey. There's a lot of things I do that are hard, that are not, don't make me feel very good, but this is one of the things that is a highlight to my job." And shared that he had a transgender child as well. And it brought me to tears, and it was such a great experience. And I was so happy that Cece and that those other two individuals had that experience. So now it's just been in the past several months that I really have felt strong promptings that I needed to share my experience, the things that I have learned. This isn't comprehensive, but it's just a little taste of what my experience and what I've learned. So it's been increasingly hard to stay engaged, in the church, in my local ward, but I've thought it important And it seems like just when I feel like, okay, and to be clear, this is a ward we moved to during COVID. And so that was hard. So just having that feeling of being integrated fully hasn't really come yet. And they don't know any of our kids, and so it's a little harder, right? So August of last year, when the new policies about transgender and non-binary members came out, I just felt like it pulled the rug out from under me and face planted and really, really had a hard time and felt grateful. I know this is maybe awful to say, but felt grateful that my child had left when they did. Because if this had happened when they were still engaged working in the nursery with the kids who adored and loved them, they would no longer be able to work with those children. And I also thought, with this transition, if they were to use the women's restroom, those women and girls would be disturbed because they present male. So I'm still striving to stay engaged. I have set specific boundaries for my mental health, but I think it's really important that I stay engaged because I can offer a different perspective and I can educate others. Now, I've heard you quote Elder Uchtdorf many times, the quote, "How often has the Holy Spirit tried to tell us something we needed to know, but couldn't get past the massive iron gate of what we thought we already knew?" That's my experience. Like my children broke my heart wide open. They opened that massive iron gate, and I realized how much I don't know. And I am so much more open to being taught by the Lord. So maybe listening to the lived experiences of others can help open that massive iron gate of ignorance so that the Spirit can teach and we can find out what the Lord's will is for each of our individual lives. So with all of my children not being in the church, there's a phrase called being on the inside of the edge. And there's, Richard Rohr uses that term, Chris Kimball in his book that he wrote. And it's necessary. I used to be right there in the middle. And now I need to be on the inside of the edge so that I can fully embrace my kids and I can help others to have some understanding so I can love church members and people who haven't had proximity or any experiences to help them to understand. And I've never had as deep of a connection or relationship with my heavenly parents as I do right now. And I treasure that. I don't ever want to do anything to give that up because it helps me to see others as they see them and to love others better. So I think it was a month ago today that we had an executive order declaring that there were only two sexes, male and female. And this came on the heels. Well, actually, it was in the middle. So Cece got married that week. Yeah, just wonderful, wonderful partner. And so at the time of the inauguration and while all that was happening, we were in this utopian bubble of a wedding and all the celebration in Santa Barbara, California. And then when we came back, we found out what happened. And I don't think a lot of people realize what the consequences of that is. Essentially, it strips all transgender and non-binary people of their rights and protections because they no longer exist. I know on all the government websites, they've taken the T off of LGBT. And it's been very difficult and scary, especially for CC. And so more than ever, I feel like it's important to speak up so people can hear, who these people are, that they really do exist, that they really are special people that have feelings that God loves just as much as all of their other children, so that maybe we can have people that are their allies, advocates, to form that wall to protect them if the government won't, There's another quote that you've said time and again that I just love. I mean, you find the best quotes, and then when you say them, then I have to go look up, where you found them and read the whole talk or the book. But from The Wounded Healer, the great illusion of leadership is to think that man can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there. Now, I don't proclaim myself as a leader, but I've been down this path more than a decade, and I know that there are people who are just finding themselves in this path. And I want to be a support. I want to be that wounded healer, someone that can put my arm around those people and tell them it's okay. There's so much joy in this journey. There's so much to learn and to feel and to experience. And so I love that quote, and I want to be that for other people. Dr. Maya Angelou said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And I think that is essential to the plan of salvation. When we learn, when we know better, we do better, we do the best we can. And love is at the center of that. We can love better when we understand the experiences of other people and have empathy for them.
Marley, I'm just so moved. You brought me to tears a couple times, and I'm sure other listeners are feeling the same way. Thank you. Thank you for your preparation. Thank you for your good heart. I've written down a few things like I usually do, listeners, that kind of were aha for me. The first thing I want to do is, Cece, if you're listening, or any of my trans non-binary friends, you are awesome. I loved all these positive experiences your mother talked about you. Just a side note, Mom continued to use they pronouns, and when I first heard that for a singular person, it kind of threw me off, but that's referring to a singular person, a non-binary singular person, so it's just a measure of respect that you're very used to using, because you did that through the whole podcast, and I've learned to just do that.
May I tell you one thing?
Yes.
I heard this explanation and it really helped. Someone said that for those pronouns, if you see someone in a distance, they drop their wallet or something and they're walking off and you can't tell who it is, you don't say, "Oh, she or he dropped their wallet." You say, "They dropped their wallet." And so for non-binary, that really works because they're, ambiguous or don't identify or identify with both. So they, them is really appropriate.
I love that analogy. That helps me. I love your mom just talking about you, CC, your brother Zach, and this interaction you had together. I love hearing about how you just loved being in the nursery with children. My trans and non-binary friends are not a threat to children. You have natural gifts of love and compassion and empathy. And I love your mom just talking about how she realized at a young age that this is some of your spiritual gift is love and compassion and empathy. I tried to write this down word for word, listeners. Before CC came out, you had, quote, an impression CC was going to come out. That CC is special. Not that this is a bad thing, not that CC's confused. That CC is special in a good way. So I just love everything that you've talked about, CC. And how I feel about all my trans and non-binary friends is positive in nature. So I love that just consistent theme of your podcast and your story. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I love the story of your grandfather, this wonderful, faithful church member in the South that was a patriarch when the priesthood ban was lifted, and he almost left the church because he was told it would never change. And I think about that because obviously he's really committed to the church and he was able to stay in. But I've thought a lot about how we build robust faith as members, and maybe it's better to talk about we're a restored church and things continue to change. And doesn't mean I know God's will or a leader, but I think it's okay to realize we may have changes to better support women. We may have changes to better support LGBTQ members because there's a lot of pain for many in both of those spaces. So that's just the way I navigate that, listeners. And I've always felt like eternal truths are unchangeable. Our doctrine is our best attempt to reflect eternal truths. And sometimes it changes as we have more understanding of eternal truths. And in the case of the priesthood ban, the eternal truth is all alike unto God. And we took a while to figure that out. And we've talked about it on prior podcasts, but just thought that was really interesting. And here you then go to the Dominican Republic, and your grandfather's there in your life as you're off to this country to help Black people find the restored gospel. So I just thought that was a really cool part of your story. Then I thought it was good you talked about painful church experiences. Listeners, we do that on this podcast because, like in your final quote, when you know better, you do better. And so I think we can still, just like you said, give talks about the doctrine of our church, but recognize we can also help people to feel that they're loved. And the proclamation of the family is something that hangs into our house, but I recognize it doesn't answer exactly the path for like a gay or a lesbian young person that doesn't feel a mixed orientation marriage is their path, that want to not be alone for the rest of their life. It doesn't really explain how that works for them and how they should walk that road and how we should support them. So it can be triggering, just like a stake presence talk about same-sex marriage. And then you said something really full of grace, Marley. You said, perhaps he hasn't traveled this path. And I just think it's so important. What you're doing and what this podcast is trying to do is to help us better understand the paths of others. I liked your honest about the 2015 policy statement. That was really uncomfortable to me. I was a YSA bishop at the time. It's probably partly the path that caused me to be an ally because I just didn't feel good about it. I just recognized it caused a lot of pain. It seemed to be reactionary to marriage equality becoming legal in the land. And I'm not saying I was right or wrong. I was just uncomfortable about it, and I recognized it caused pain. So I thought you were great about that. I thought about this story, this really thoughtful insight, and I'm going to mess up the medical term. I wrote it down here as Symetric twin syndrome. Chimera twin syndrome. And that CC has 6 molars and may have the DNA of Zach. And even if that's proved to be true or not true, I love that you're inviting us all to love non-binary people, even if there's a scientific story explaining why someone feels that way. But there very well may be. And I wrote down here as you were talking, science is our friend. And I think we better understand, to me, science is an insight into how the priesthood works. And it sort of helps us understand those things. So I believe that as we go on in time, we'll understand through science and through proximity why someone is transgender and why someone is non binary. And that's just who they are. And I would say that it's pleasing to God. There's no like failing in being non binary as you talk about your wonderful child and all the things that they are doing. There's no like, just, there's no bad outcome here. The bad outcome is just the pain they feel navigating their way in society versus their ability to fully contribute as a full member of society. So I think science is our friend was the next thing I wrote down. Next thing I wrote down is this discussion I've had with one of our sons, and he says, Dad, a lot of people kind of get a story and then they find content that kind of supports their current story. And it's harder to be willing to change our story as new content or even be open to new content. So that's a little bit about your Elder Uchtdorf. How often has this Holy Spirit tried to tell us something we needed to know? So both Marley and I are obviously trying to change our story as we're presented with new information. And we think that's part of just discipleship, of being willing to learn, to be curious, and to grow. And that's just a great theme of your podcast. Then I wrote down, I want to be like the judge. And just what a beautiful moment. And I think of Christ as our judge, and Christ in situations where he would be in a position to lift burden and teach and help us better love each other. So I love his ministry. And he said, this is the best part of my job. And I wonder if Christ would have said the same thing when he did so much healing of people that society didn't think they were worthy of being healed. The woman with an issue of blood is one I think of when she broke protocol and touched him, and everybody thought he was going to really be mad at her when he asked who did that. But in a teaching moment, he taught us differently.
Can I comment on that?
Please.
I read Adam Miller's Original Grace, and he talked about justice and mercy. And I loved what he said about justice not being what is deserved, but what is needed. And as our perfect judge, if that's how we want to call him, he always does what is needed.
Oh, I love that. I love you're married, Cece, and you've got a partner in this beautiful, you can get on with your life and share it with somebody. So that just made me happy. I loved you being vulnerable and the courage it took to be open about your own journey with the church, and the courage it is to stay on the inside and to engage in the church, even when the church can be a source of pain to you and especially your kids. I thought that was just so thoughtful, and it helps others that there's a lot of people, including me, that are trying to stay in the church. And our goal is to stay in the church and find a way to stay engaged and navigate the complexity, especially of this path. And often there's not much of a space for us. And I just think we can create better space in our ward cultures with increased kindness, increased understanding. And so I thought that was just really brave of you to do that. And so thank you for your courage to be vulnerable. And then I wanted to read another story. Episode 631 is Parents That Lost a Trans Kid to Suicide, Levi Martin. And we don't want to lose anybody to suicide. And you've walked that road and worked through difficult chapters. And now you've got this kid in a really good spot in hormone therapy, giving him better hope. These parents were doing a great job, LDS parents. I'm reading from Levi's obituary. Levi's gender was intersex, caused by Swyer syndrome, meaning he presented as female at birth, although he was genetically male. This result in a condition of gender dysphoria came with a host of medical and mental medical issues. His final message stuff was full of love, grace, and forgiveness, as well as an expression of the vast difficulties he faced, and he signed his name Levi, which we deliberately use in his honor and ask that you do the same. So just like you might have sort of a scientific understanding of why your child Cece is non-binary, they did have an understanding of why their son Levi was intersex. And so but I think both of us are inviting not to wait till the science helps us understand this before we support. I don't think there's a litmus test that somebody needs to go through to have our love. I think their feeling our love helps them make better decisions going forward. And and a lot of these stories do change, especially for someone who's in the gender dysphoria world where they go from pansexual to non-binary. I don't think that means we should roll our eyes and think, oh no, here comes something again. We should just walk with them on their path as they're figuring out just where they are. And any comments?
Yeah, how many of us are the same people at our age that we were at 16 or 20 or, it's a constant evolution. And I think we just need to trust that people know how they feel and trust them.
I love you talking about the political realities right now, as well as the church's change. And that's just heartbreaking for me. Friend of mine said, how do you feel? Do you want to talk about it? I just said, I'm sad. I'm sad. There just seems to be no upside to that. We've created fear around people that are different than us for all of humanity's existence. It seems to be a natural thing to protect us. And maybe when we were threatened physically by different tribes, that was really important. Historians could come on the podcast and talk about all the groups that we created fear around, that once we learned and had a proximity to that group, we recognized that wasn't needed. I think of the Salem witch trials. I think of Black people. I think of all sorts of different groups of people. You could name more than I can. And right now, our trans and non-binary friends are in the crosshairs of that, and we've made them the bogeyman, and it creates a lot of common enemy intimacy Dr. Brene Brown talks about. If the bond we share is simply we hate the same group, the intimacy we experience is intense, gratifying, and an easy way to discharge our outrage and pain. It's not fuel for real connection. So, yeah, I've been guilty of that, where I sort of develop common intimacy around a different group of a different church, people that have left our church, people in a different political party, people in a different sports team. And I recognize a higher, holier law is just to have honest, fact-based discussions and try to bring us together. God may be bigger than our boxes we put ourselves in. And I've always thought Zion is more about unity versus sameness. And
I heard Patrick Mason one time talk about conflict, right? And he said that there's conflict in all of nature, and where the two sides meet is where the beauty is. Where the water meets the land, you have the beach. Where you have daytime meeting nighttime, you have dusk. And anyway, that's where the beauty is finding that where they come together and being curious and finding that common ground.
I love that. And maybe that, we do have dawn and dusk, and we do have, and we've given them names, and we've recognized their beautiful limited times in the 24-hour day. It seems like photographers are pretty active in dawn and dusk, capturing the beauty of that short time. And maybe that's how we should approach non-binary people, that, yeah, they're a gender minority, but it's a beautiful, just like you're talking about Cece. And hopefully, we can do what we can in our circle of influence to better support and understand, because right now it's really painful. I want to share a teaching experience I had, listeners. I spoke, as I do sometimes, and somebody came up to me in tears and gave me a really good correction. And at the end of my presentation, I talked to the allies in the group, and I said, don't take on a new cause. I don't want to burden you that you feel responsible now to change the world or to take on a new cause or to add to your to-do list, because I'm sensitive to allies and we've all got a lot going on. And but then a trans person came up to me and just said, that was so painful for me to hear you do that. Because right now I need all the allies I can get. And I need people to step into the uncomfortable spaces of being an ally so that I can live and so that I can have hope. And boy, that was a really good teaching moment for me. And I could just tell the pain in this transgender person that was visiting with me and the difficulty of their road. And so that was a little bit of I wanted to share that with us listeners, just what we can do to be allies and step in these uncomfortable spaces. I love the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. That's the best song for me as an ally, is your job is to shine, meaning my non-binary and trans friends. My job is to not leave you. I think the verse is something like this, swim right behind you. And I love the visual that, I'm there. And if things get tough, I'm going to not get in front of you and take the credit. I'm going to make you sign, but I'm right behind you, kind of this invisible person in your court that's got your back, like you as a mom, Marley, the judge, and that young woman's leader that you talked about that did everything she could to help your bond CC feel welcome. So I'll turn it back to you, Marley. You probably have some more thoughts you'd like to share.
Well, I don't know. Just what you said is so beautiful. And I just think what a wonderful person you are to be able to be open to, correction, like getting someone's perspective and making that change like that. That's what we all need to do, right? We do the best we can with what right now. And then when we know better, we do better. So what a perfect example of that. I just think, boy, if I had anything else to say, it was just that, maybe go out of your way if you don't know someone who is transgender, non-binary, or really anyone in the queer community, and just get to know them. Just see their goodness and see how they contribute to the world, the good that they put into the world. And, they're not by any means a mistake. I believe that they need to be here. They need to be our teachers.
Thank you, Marley Orton. On behalf of everybody's listening, thank you for following your impressions and coming to share your story on the podcast, and honored to provide this space where brave people like Marley can share their stories so we can all do better. And I'm grateful for the spirit that's here. Actually, we do start with a prayer before we record, but often the spirit really impacts me during these podcasts and get tears in my eyes. And I'm grateful for this platform of vulnerability and honesty where we can share these stories. So Marley Orton and the whole Orton family, and Cece, if you're listening, and all of our listeners, thank you for joining us on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.